Well, good afternoon. Appreciate you all being here. I think you're going to find it's going to be a very interesting afternoon. We've got Vice Admiral Morgan, who is going to be our speaker today, and is going to tell you, I think, about a very exciting activity and initiative that's been going on with the U.S. Navy and the Coast Guard and the Marine Corps. And I'll turn it over to Admiral Morgan, who I think has been an individual that has had a great deal of experience over the course of his career, both at sea and in various staff positions, and is now serving as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Information Plans and Strategy in Washington. So let me turn it over to him.
George, thank you. Appreciate it. Good afternoon. If I can correct one thing is, I'm going to try to be a good listener, not a good talker. But before I begin to listen, I'd like to introduce two very distinguished naval officers who are sitting in the back. Admiral Donegan and Captain Cloyd are with us today, and those guys are legitimate Top Gun guys. Both are fighter pilots. Both have commanded the premier ships in the United States Navy, nuclear aircraft carriers. So I appreciate both of you guys being here today. I got a question for you. It's 4:45. Today is what, Wednesday? Why'd you come?
Seemed like an interesting topic.
Yeah.
And you seem like someone that was knowledgeable about the topic, so it seemed interesting.
How about you? You're with him? Free food? Okay, that's an added feature. How many of you have spent any time at all, be honest, thinking about American Seapower, just maybe in the last 2 or 3 months? Okay, all the people in uniform. Well, this is encouraging. So why did you come today?
Oh, because of the topic and because our son is in the Navy.
So why is American Seapower important? Why do you think?
To defend us, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to see how we're going to go into this new century, really.
That's fair. I agree with that. Any other thoughts? Yes, sir.
And to project our power abroad.
And to project our power abroad. Anything else? Why did you come today?
Well, I just thought it was an interesting topic, and I don't know, it just sounded pretty interesting. And
why is it interesting, though?
Well, I don't know. Our America's power, it really kind of depends on the strength of our military and our Navy, and like what happens in the future really depends on what happens here at home. So, with our Navy.
So here you are, a student at a great university, and you're obviously preparing for your future. Does this topic interest you because of what impact it might have on your future?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I would think so too. Let me ask another question. How many of you think in terms, when you think about Seapower, American Seapower, how many of you link the notion of American Seapower to the strength of the American economy? Okay, so you think those two things are directly related. Would you agree? So, if I were, I don't know, are you 19, 20 years old?
22. Yeah.
Okay, I'm more than twice your age, but I would think that everybody looked at the world markets yesterday, whether you own stock or not. You wonder what the heck's going on. But I would imagine if I were 22 years old, and I'm thinking, well, how am I going to earn a living when I'm 40 years old, or what's my economic prosperity going to look like? I think that's probably not central on your mind day in and day out, but certainly a factor. I'm holding something that I found absolutely fascinating. This is a thing called Strat4, Strategic Forecasting. It's a private company owned by a gentleman by the name of Dr. George Friedman. Dr. Friedman lives in Austin, Texas. And this is almost like a private intelligence company. I mean, it looks at geostrategic trends around the world, and it can tell you, geez, what is the Bhutto assassination going to mean to the stability of the Middle East and all kinds of things. Well, on the 31st of December of 2007, less than a month ago, he wrote this net assessment of the United States. Where does the United States, where does it fit into the big global geostrategic picture? And he concluded two things in this report. He said there are two pillars to America's strength and position in the world. Two. One of them is the American economy, largest economy in the world. And the second pillar to American strength is our ability to control the oceans of the world. Now, you would have thought a guy like me in uniform would have written something like that. But I was absolutely amazed that Dr. Friedman concluded that. So when I ask you why you came, and when I ask you about your future, and what do you think about it, and the links between American Seapower and the American economy, I think it's a terribly interesting topic. And I want to tell you that we've spent about the last year and a half trying to sort of take stock and see where we are and where we ought to go in the future. So I've done enough talking, but I do want to tell you that tomorrow at 9 o'clock at the Federal Reserve Bank in downtown Houston, we're going to invite the 150 Americans to come listen and for us to listen to them as well about the importance of American Seapower and its relationship to the economy. So I want to thank you for being here. I want to introduce Lieutenant John Ennis. We have a couple of other young officers, one from the Coast Guard and one from the Marine Corps. But John's going to tell you, he's going to begin to tell you why it's important that the Marine Corps, the Coast Guard, and the Navy got together on trying to shape a strategy for us as we go into the future. So with that, John Ennis, thanks. No. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, sir. To start off, by way of two quick administrative announcements, if you do have cell phones, please silence them as we're taping, and it might affect the sensitivity of the equipment. And two, you'll notice small critique sheets in the brochures and our strategies that you have in front of you. The answer to number one, where it says, what part of the presentation did you find most enjoyable? That would be me. My name is John Ennis. I work for Admiral Morgan at the Pentagon. I've been there for about 15 months or so. I grew up in New Jersey and attended the Naval Academy and have been on two ships, one most recently deployed to the Persian Gulf. There's one really big idea inside of this strategy that's not referred to by that critique sheet, and that is that there is this global or international system. Now, there's always been a global system. It's just that today, the individual elements or subsystems of trade, information, governance, finance, and movement of people have never been more interrelated or interdependent. As Kevin Bacon said in his opening arguments, of A Few Good Men, these are the facts of the case, and they are undisputed. Well, I suppose that I have some sort of contention to make to you today that's also supported by my colleagues, as you'll find later. And that is that fostering and sustaining this global system through which the prosperity of the United States and many nations on earth is maintained and advanced is what maritime forces, Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard do. As Admiral Morgan mentions, 90% of the world's trade, 90% of the world's trade travels across the oceans. The Port of Houston alone handled more than 200 million tons of cargo last year. Now, the incredible amount of goods that move around the world are a result of an innovation essentially in the way that goods are stored. It's called the just-in-time delivery system. Essentially, rather than create or maintain, I should say, the large sorts of warehouses on land that we've had for hundreds of years, we've created floating warehouses at sea on large container vessels. So essentially, once that ship pulls in at the Port of Houston, the PlayStation 3 that was sitting in one of those cargo holds makes it to the Walmart shelf in St. Louis, Missouri in about 2.5 weeks, give or take. The pace of information exchange these days is staggering. This will probably make me seem a bit old, but AOL Instant Messenger came out my freshman year of college. Now, of course, today that seems like an obvious thing that everybody uses from my 14-year-old brother on up, but back then it was absolutely amazing and clearly the coolest thing imaginable. On to governance. At the inception of the United States of America, ancient Greece probably stood as the only real successful democracy in history. Now today, the amount of truly representative governments, ones that have power dispersed between legislative, executive, and judicial branches, now number around 120, give or take. Here's the fact. The fact is that folks around the world, enabled by an increased capacity to buy and sell goods, as well as a greater awareness of the world around them facilitated by better information exchange, will only develop a deeper desire to govern themselves in the decades ahead. This area of Houston in particular is one that has been greatly enriched by the movement of people. And though most people think that America is driving down a road towards overpopulation, the fact is that many analysts believe that if we continue our hard-nosed immigration and emigration policies, we will in all likelihood face a labor shortage in this country around 2045. And in Europe, the situation is even much more dire. When you look at their current birth rate and death rate, coupled with the closed-door policies of many of the European Union countries, you will notice an absolute trend of population decrease right now. That's happening right now. So at some point, and we really do have to come up with an answer to this question, where are all the workers going to come from to keep this engine of globalization that has so benefited the American people and the world writ large running? How many of you have investments in the audience? Quite a few, I would imagine. I don't have nearly as many as I want. But as Admiral Morgan mentioned, have you noticed that whenever the New York Stock Exchange posts a strong or incredibly weak series of days of trading, as they have this week, it's almost always initially impacted by something that happens in China or Japan. As the Chinese market fell 9%, we went down 430 points. It was either today or yesterday, luckily recovering, but it's all interconnected. And all of this exists to an integrated level never before seen in human history. But most of all, it works to the benefit of the American people. As I said, you have a pamphlet in front of you that was inelegantly reproduced on my first slide. And this is our maritime strategy, and we invite you to read it. This strategy stresses an unprecedented amount of cooperation between the United States and our friends around the world. We recognize clearly that no one nation has the ability to be everywhere at all times, but an expansive collaboration of countries can surely come close. Now, some of you may have probably read about the recent pirate attacks on a North Korean vessel off the coast of Somalia. Now, when I say pirate, I'm not talking about Johnny Depp and the Black Pearl. There's nothing cool or exciting about what these guys are doing. Basically, a group of criminals races up next to a merchant vessel, boards it, takes it over, holds the crew at gunpoint, and takes the crew and the ship hostage until a ransom is paid to them by the shipping company. They're armed robbers on boats, nothing more and nothing less. And as I alluded to earlier, a few months ago, a U.S. Navy ship came to the aid of that North Korean merchant, killing or capturing the criminals. Now, clearly, I'm sure that you're all familiar with relations between the United States and North Korea, fragile at best, tenuous at worst. But for a mariner, there is no choice. If someone is in peril on the sea, you come to their aid regardless of national, cultural, or political, or religious affiliation. Truly, while we understand and operate under the constraints of international law, we seek to expand the bounds of international cooperation. All of us that sail are bound by the violent majesty of the sea. In a sense, we all share a common enemy. So it remains in our interest to come together and to work the problem together. Nuclear disarmament talks between the United States and North Korea were ongoing at the time of that rescue. And that rescue was credited with helping to seal the deal of North Korea's decision to comply and to disarm. Despite the forward-thinking efforts to develop alternative sources of energy, the cold truth is that fossil fuels will continue to dominate the landscape for decades to come and must be guaranteed by the presence of U.S. Seapower. I spent the summer of 2006 in the Persian Gulf, and I can tell you two things. One is it's incredibly hot, and Houston summers can't possibly hold a flame. And two, the tankers and merchants sailing through the Persian Gulf and the waters across the oceans of the world, carrying 90% of global trade, are well protected by U.S. maritime forces operating in concert with those of other nations. This is what I like to call my iPhone slide. And if anybody has an iPhone, this might kind of come as some news to you. And I should mention at the outset that this is not sanctioned by Apple, but it's fairly representative of the process. These are how the 800 or 900 trillion or so parts come together. And you should notice at the bottom at those bullets there that there are 8 distinct places where this thing gets assembled. Keep that thought in your mind and I'll come back to it. Irrespective of what you believe to be the sources of climate change, we all must agree that the climate is changing and that maritime forces must be ready to respond to more frequent and more devastating natural disasters, both at home and abroad, in the coming years. Many of us remember the tragedy in Banda Aceh, Sumatra, and the video broadcasting the catastrophic damage inflicted by the tsunami. What you might not remember is footage of the USS Abraham Lincoln, an aircraft carrier built for combat that was launching helicopters providing food and aid to the victims of that natural disaster. And after Hurricane Katrina, it was the USNS Comfort, a hospital ship, that was seeing nearly 2,000 patients that could not be seen on land due to infrastructure problems. And recently, the USNS Comfort plied the waters around Latin America with doctors from not only all the branches of the armed services, but from multiple non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, embarked repairing cleft palates, distributing eyeglasses, and instilling hope. Yet our maritime forces must do more. We must do more than simply respond to these disasters. It is in the interest of the United States to have specially trained folks on the ground and in the water surrounding troubled areas, helping the lives of troubled people. We view humanitarian assistance as a key component of preventing war, as these operations often collect and dispose of the seeds of despair before they can take root and develop in the minds of those who would later seek to destroy. Think about this for a second and put yourself in the shoes of a 6-year-old Bangladeshi boy. In fact, he almost certainly doesn't have shoes because he can't afford them. But think about this. Your house was just destroyed by the monsoon that swept through the area a couple months ago. And one of the first things that you see is a U.S. Marine from a nearby American warship who's bringing you a sandwich and a blanket. Now, I'm clearly not saying that this kid's going to walk around the rest of his life draped in an American flag and rooting for the Cowboys. Go Giants, by the way. But perhaps, he may just grow into manhood with a slightly better view of America and not join an extremist group bent on destroying the United States. Not to mention the fact that we probably saved his life, as well as those of thousands of others who would have died of thirst 3 or 4 days later, by being already on the ground and already in the water surrounding that area, ready to respond and exercise American compassion. Now, of course, these two will always remain at the heart of what we do. In the hours after the September 11th attacks, the admiral in charge of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet immediately scrambled Navy destroyers to the northeast, right off the coast of states like New York and New Jersey, to provide air defense to major cities on the eastern seaboard. But Homeland Defense truly starts thousands of miles away, as maritime forces will continue to defend the homeland by identifying and neutralizing threats as far from our shores as possible. And this is done by fostering critical relationships overseas, to screening ships bound for our ports, or rapidly responding to any threats approaching our coastline. Our homeland defense effort will be comprehensive in the hopes that we don't have to respond close to our coastline. Although make no mistake, we are ready to do so if we need to. And where conflict threatens the global system and our national interests, maritime forces will be ready to respond alongside other elements of national and multinational power. The fact is that we exist to give political leaders the options necessary to do their jobs. We're out there watching events happen around the world, around the clock, to make sure that the United States is never left without a chair when the music stops. Maritime forces that are consistently present and always combat ready provide the means for this nation to respond quickly and effectively and decisively to crises. Whether over the horizon and out of sight or powerfully arrayed in plain sight, maritime forces can deter the ambitions of regional aggressors, assure friends and allies, and protect our citizens while working to protect the global system. So that's your global system. Ships moving along all of these trade routes carry the lifeblood of this system, not to mention all of the distinct parts of hardware necessary to put together goods and services like your iPod and your iPhone. even if your LG flip phone is not good enough, contractual issues notwithstanding. And let me quickly demonstrate what I meant earlier when I was talking about how this was such an interrelated system. If you look up at the map there, an oil disruption in the Straits of Hormuz, right by Saudi Arabia and Iran, may affect the ability of a factory in China to heat and cool their facility. Now, changes in the work output ultimately go across the Sea of Japan and impact the stock market in Japan, thereby impacting Wall Street, just as has happened the last couple days. And what happens to that is the Federal Reserve Board responds. Recently, they just slashed interest rates, which, by the way, not only is it designed to counter inflation, but it also makes your iPhone cheaper because you're purchasing it with a lower interest rate credit card. I can do this for hours and with just about anything imaginable. This is interrelated to an extent that it never has before. And here's the point. When the world experiences hardship, America must cope. But when the world prospers, so do we. The fact is that we, as your maritime forces, can do more, we should do more. In fact, we must do more to keep you safe and to advance that which you hold most dear, the American way of life. For me, it comes back to something my mother told me when I was 12 years old. Yours is a life worth living, she said. And I suspect that the parents of everyone in this room would say the same thing. And it's the job of my boss and me and Chris and John and everyone else who wears these uniforms to do so, to make sure that you have the opportunity to do so to the fullest, however you see fit. So these are the facts of the case, and they are undisputed. Thank you very much. I want to now introduce Captain Chris Brower. Chris works at the Marine Corps Combat Development Facility in Quantico. Chris is going to give you the Marine Corps perspective on the maritime strategy. Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you. I'll be getting a little more specific, but it also ties into the larger picture that was presented by Lieutenant Ennis. While most nations will seek to prosper in the increasingly interconnected global community that is dependent on commerce from the sea, there are also many rogue states, non-state actors that are also looking for their piece of the pie. They are also looking to interfere with our ability to prosper. And most of these countries are located within a region that we call the Arc of Instability. Our view of the future has been informed not only by our own intelligence agencies, but also by independent sources such as National Geographic Society. And these sources provide useful data about conditions that can lead to instability and competition for resources, as well as areas that are more prone to are more prone to instability, competition for resources, and environmental disasters, and also health crises. These are also areas that are, without strong leadership, can pose catalysts for conflict. Both historical data and future projections demonstrate the need for a strong naval capability that is forward deployed and capable of meeting a variety of humanitarian disaster relief operations, training assistance missions, as well as full high-intensity combat operations. While rising peer competitors such as China challenge the U.S. economically and increasingly militarily, the most likely conflicts that the Marine Corps will find itself countering are hybrid conflicts. Failing or failed states, along with non-state actors such as Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, obviously, cannot and will not try to take us on by conventional means. Instead, they will try to counter our conventional superiority through their increasing access to sophisticated weapons, information technology, weapons of mass destruction, as well as obviously terrorism that we've all seen. By 2030, it is predicted that more than 80% of the world's population will live within 50 miles of the coastline. To counter complex irregular challenges posed by hybrid conflicts, we must have access to the littoral regions of the world. In order to have a coherent strategy for gaining access to these critical regions of the world, the Navy and the Marine Corps, along with the Coast Guard, wrote a cooperative strategy for the 21st century Seapower, otherwise known as the Maritime Strategy. The Navy and Marine Corps team is uniquely suited to advance our interests around the world through the effective application of global reach, persistent presence, and operational flexibility. This requirement for flexibility places a premium on agile, highly capable maritime forces, organized, trained, and equipped to operate whenever and whenever needed. It is easy to envision a future in which our nation must engage in multiple commitments across the globe and across the spectrum of conflict. The combatant commanders' increased demand for mission-tailored force packages requires an integrated approach to how maritime forces are created and employed. This can be achieved through sea basing. The maritime domain that we operate in includes the world's oceans, bays, estuaries, coastal areas, littorals, and airspace above those areas. The naval services are particularly well designed to operate in these areas. Sea basing provides the President a capability to promote stability, build partnerships, and respond to a crisis. Sea basing is a national capability for joint service, interagency cooperation, and multinational operations. A sea base provides the naval services a multi-mission, flexible, scalable, and persistent capability positioned to minimize the footprint ashore. This slide gives you a visual representation of the Joint Sea Base, what it consists of, and some of its capabilities. It shows how the Marine Air Ground Task Force, positioned aboard amphibious vessels and supported by the sea base, can rapidly respond to a wide spectrum of operations. Here we see some of the major enablers of sea basing, of the sea basing capability that will operationalize the maritime strategy. We believe that the amphibious fleet and the maritime prepositioning force of the future, the next generation, are the pillars around which the joint sea base will be realized in the near future. Sea basing allows the combatant commander to rapidly task organize his forces to meet mission requirements. The Joint Sea Base will not only enable forcible entry operations, but disaster relief, non-combatant evacuation operations, piracy prevention, counter-drug operations, as well as many other missions. The Joint Sea Base is a national imperative in the future of restricted access. Sea basing allows the naval services to operate in a secure environment, providing freedom of action and maneuver space at a time and place of our choosing. It significantly reduces, if not eliminates, the need to build the so-called Iron Mountain, which is very large and very vulnerable logistics bases ashore that are most times not always popular with the local populations. The maritime strategy, along with the concept of sea basing, will help enable our naval forces, the naval forces of our country, to protect our homeland and the global commerce that from the sea, while positioning forces rapidly, responding to crises, and fostering cooperative relationships around the world. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lieutenant Commander Pruitt of the United States Coast Guard. He works at the Office of Strategic Analysis in Washington, D.C. Sir?
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Pruitt III from the United States Coast Guard, and I'd like to provide you with some perspective of the Coast Guard and how my service is and holds a unique role within the U.S. Seapower, springboarding as part of a cooperative strategy for 21st century Seapower. This strategy helps to reinforce the time-honored missions and traditions of the Coast Guard that have been carried on in our service since 1790. I guess the ultimate question is, why a new maritime services strategy? It really boils down to the fact that the world's changing. To address a new spectrum of threats and challenges within the global maritime system, and, to integrate maritime security operations on both a domestic and global scale, involving the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. And so here I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Coast Guard and our specific role within the strategy and on our day-to-day basis. The Coast Guard, a true military, multi-mission maritime force. We are a member of the armed forces, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and Marines. Where we vary a little bit is that we have law enforcement and regulatory authority. We have Title 10 and Title 14 U.S. Code authority, which means that here in the Port of Houston, we also regulate shipping of commercial vessels throughout this area. Posse Comitatus does not apply to the Coast Guard. For those of you who may not know what that is, Posse Comitatus essentially is what prevents, or as our founding fathers looked at it, kept the military from actually working potentially against our home shores here. We also have a wide network of partnerships as we kind of work between the worlds of DOD and DHS, Department of Homeland Security. We have international, federal, state, and local authorities that we work with on a day-to-day basis. We truly are different, but similar than our DOD partners. We are flexible, adaptable, operationally capable, and have presence around the world. We have multi-mission platforms that operate from the shores of Lake Tahoe, which is, I had to throw that up there because of skiing and snowboarding, to the Bering Sea. Right now, there are Coast Guard cutters operating right here in the Port of Houston, off of Galveston, outside the Port of San Diego, and plying their trade and working up the Mississippi and Columbia rivers. We are rapidly deployable with a DOG. Stands for Deployable Operations Group, which is essentially our combination of all of our deployable forces in the Coast Guard. Those forces include some of my former units, tactical law enforcement teams that deploy around the world, conducting counter-narcotics operations, working with the United Nations in places such as Bosnia and Herzegovina, working in Iraq, helping to train the Iraqi Navy on how to actually conduct operations for law enforcement and for safety and security around their own coast. And also, those forces, as part of our contingent forces of DOG, many of you may remember the anthrax scare throughout D.C. and various places. Well, those were actually Coast Guard folks that were actually helping to clean and ensure the safety of the houses and halls of Congress. We work from Iraq to Katrina. We are global and local. I myself was in Iraq from the opening days of the war for the next 7 or so months. The Coast Guard, as many of you remember, during Katrina and Rita, were plied their trade on a daily basis here throughout this region of the Gulf Coast. With Katrina, the Coast Guard saved over 33,000 people within that period of operation. 33,000 people. Staggering amount of people saved by this service. We had help, too. We had help from our Navy brothers, as Lieutenant Ennis mentioned. Cooperative strategy. That's why we're here. We are the U.S. lead for numerous international maritime fora. International rulemaking bodies such as the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, a great body that helps to bring nations together for partnerships as we talked about with the strategy, partnerships, and to help improve standards and agreements, international standards, procedures, and regulations for mariners and trade all around the world. And this is becoming increasingly important to the DoD as the U.S. Coast Guard tends to work within our globalized maritime system. Again, combating problems throughout the world, piracy, weapons proliferation, and truly a problem, the illegal movement of people around the world. We are broad in reach, but not at large organizations. So what do we have to rely on? We rely on partnerships. As our strategy puts forth the idea of partnerships, not just here, but abroad. We have 45,000 proud men and women, roughly the size of the New York City Police Department. But we conduct operations from the Bering Sea to the South Pole and everywhere in between. In the Northern Arabian Gulf, we work with our Navy, Marine, and coalition partners to secure the Iraqi oil platforms. Right now, 6 Coast Guard cutters as part of Coast Guard Patrol Forces Southwest Asia work with 4 Navy patrol boats protecting the waters around Iraq. In the Western Pacific, we work with partners conducting aerial surveillance, fisheries enforcement, drug interdiction, illegal migration, and, again, piracy prevention. Around the world, piracy. And, amazingly enough to many people, we've actually conducted joint law enforcement operations with China. Very recently, protecting fisheries in terms of high seas drift nets with China. A country that many people in this world, and at least in this country, have distinct problems with. But partnerships, it's about partnerships and how we can work together to make our world a better place. And we can work with China. The North Atlantic, we have the North Atlantic Coast Guard Forum. And the North Pacific, we have the North Pacific Coast Guard Forum. And they are truly embodiments of the cooperative strategy. As an example, the North Atlantic, the Coast Guard works with 18 nations in that region in terms of law enforcement, search and rescue, and other issues and problems on a global scale. We all work together. Again, it's partnerships that help to make things work. So you can see, we work, again, not just here, but we do work truly abroad. And one of the things that allows us, specifically as a Coast Guard, to do that is that most of the world's navies truly deal with the Coast Guard. The Guatemalan Navy, the Belgian Navy, the Denmark Navy, the Irish Navy, all navies. But they work operations such as counter-narcotics, illegal migration, search and rescue, all trades the Coast Guard prides itself on a day-to-day basis. Again, continuing with the theme of partnerships. In the Arctic, there are only 3 Arctic-capable surface ships within the U.S. inventory. They are all U.S. Coast Guard cutters. There is a changing environment in our world. We call it global warming. What's that mean for the Arctic? Increased accessibility, increased exploration, which means increased merchant ship traffic, increased SAR problems, increased potential environmental disasters, oil spills, mariners at sea at risk. What's that mean? The Coast Guard has to be there. Sovereignty concerns. Recently, we've had a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and a U.S. Coast Guard aircraft fly over the North Pole. The Coast Guard cutter Healy conducted a continental shelf survey roughly around the same time to verify U.S. claims that many of you may remember that a Russian submarine planted a flag on the Arctic Ocean floor directly underneath the North Pole. Our maritime strategy, it truly is global in reach, seamless in coverage, and involves the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. As we say, semper paratus, always prepared as we move toward the 21st century. Thank you.